In this video lesson, we're going to be looking at comparing fractions. When you're comparing fractions, you're deciding which fraction is greater or larger and which is less. You're going to use the same comparison symbols that you use when you're comparing whole numbers. So we have the greater than symbol, less than symbol, and the equal symbol or equivalent fractions. And remember that the alligator wants to eat the larger number, or as I like to do, Pac-Man. He's going after the bigger number. So the bigger number is the one where the mouth is facing. Let's start by doing a quick review of equivalent fractions. Two fractions are equivalent or equal if they represent the same amount of the whole. So they're taking up the same amount of space of the whole. If you look at the fractions 1/2 and 2/4, you can see that they are equivalent. They take up the same amount of space. If you look at the top, they line up, the bottoms line up. There are two pieces on this side, one piece on this side. So we have 2/4 is equal to 1/2. Here's another example. If you're looking at 1/4, 1/4 is equivalent to or equal to 2/8. It takes two of these 1/8 pieces to equal this 1/4 piece. Now, before we get into comparing, just a quick terminology, vocabulary, quick lesson. The top number in a fraction is called the numerator. So if I'm looking at 3/5, the numerator is 3, and it tells us how many pieces there are. The bottom number is called the denominator, and the denominator in the bottom tells us how big the piece is, the size of the piece. So first we're going to start with the easier comparisons, comparing fractions with the same denominator. So that means that the bottom number will be the same in each of these comparisons. So you'll also notice with the little fraction tiles, the fraction stacks that I'm using, that I'm going to be using all the same color. Because what that means is my denominator is going to be the same. In this case, I'm looking at fourths. And all of the 1/4 pieces are going to be this magenta color. So this is 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4. So I'm looking at like denominators, 4 in the bottom, 4 in the bottom. When I'm looking at that, all I have to do to decide which one is greater is to look at the numerator. So here I have a numerator of 1, that means one piece. Here in 3/4 I have 3 pieces, 3 parts. 1 is less than 3, so 1/4 is less than 3/4. Pac-Man wants to eat 3/4. In this example, we're looking at eighths. So the eighths pieces are a little bit smaller. On this side, we have 5 pieces. So this is 5/8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This side, we have 3 pieces, so it is 3/8. Again, our denominators are the same. That's the first thing we should check. Since 5 is greater than 3, 5/8 is greater than 3/8. And I always like to draw Pac-Man. He's very hungry for fractions. One last example where we have the same denominator. In this case, we're looking at pieces that are 1/6 of the whole. So you can see 6 is our denominator for both of these fractions. On this side, we have 2 pieces, so this fraction is 2/6. On this side, we have 3 pieces, so this fraction is 3/6. Since the denominators are the same, all I have to do is compare the numerators. And since 2 is less than 3, 2/6 is less than 3/6. Okay, so now we're going to look at comparing fractions with the same numerator, but different denominators. What that means is they're going to be the same number of pieces, but the pieces will be different sizes. This requires a little bit more thought, or the use of your fraction strips. It's a little trickier because the fractions are different from whole numbers. If you think back, you remember when we divided fractions, or when we divided a whole, into parts, the more parts we divided that whole into, the smaller the part was. So if you look at these fraction stacks, you can see over on the left-hand side, I have the 1 whole bar. Next to it, I have the 1/2. That means it takes 2 of these bars, the denominator's 2, it takes 2 of them to equal 1 of the wholes. Then we have the 1/3 with a denominator of 3, 1/4 with a denominator of 4, 1/6 with a denominator of 6, and 1/8 with a denominator of 8. What you notice is the larger the denominator, the smaller the piece. This one has a denominator of 8, but it's the smallest piece. This one has a denominator of 2, but it's the largest piece. That's because the bottom number, the denominator, tells me how many people I'm sharing with. The more people I have to share with, if I'm sharing with 8, I get a much smaller piece of the cake than if I only have to share with 3 people. So here we have 2 fractions. This fraction is 2/3. So we've got 2 of the 1/3 pieces, 2 pieces. 2 pieces on this side, but each of them are 1/4. So the numerators are the same, but the denominators are different. When the denominators are different, we have to think about the size of the piece. And this is where it's a little bit backward for us because we're used to thinking about whole numbers. Whereas with fractions, 3 is going to be greater than fourths. 1/3, this piece, is larger than this piece. So 2/3 is greater than 2/4. Here we have 1/2 and 1/6 that we're comparing. Each of them have one piece. There's one piece here and one piece here. So my numerators for both of these fractions are 1. But my denominators are different. And when my denominators are different, I have to think about the size of the piece. Larger denominator, smaller piece. Smaller denominator, larger piece. So you can tell from the picture that 1/2 is greater than 1/6, even though 6 is a larger number when we think about whole numbers. Pac-Man wants to eat 1/2. In this example, we're looking at 3 pieces on each side. On the left-hand side, we have 3 pieces that are each 1/8. So we have 3/8. On the right-hand side, we're looking at 3 pieces, but each piece is 1/6. So that means 3/6. So when I'm looking at comparing two fractions with the same numerator, I have to think about the size of the denominator. Eighths are smaller pieces than sixths. So 3/8 is less than 3/6. The thing to remember is the larger the denominator, the smaller the piece. So when you're comparing two fractions with the same numerator, the larger denominator is the smaller fraction. Larger denominator, smaller fraction. And for any teachers who might see this video, I was using the fraction stacks from Ideal School Supply, and they were purchased at Lakeshore. They're really cool because you can stack them. They come on this little rack, and you can stack them up and use them really easily for comparing. And they have the little pieces that come apart.